Newt Gingrich is with us. He says, don't underestimate Trump, and if you do so, do it at your own peril. Also, as Newt has some observations about 2018 that are not conventional thinking on the part of the media, because they think 2018 is going to be a wipeout of the Republican Party. Mr. Speaker, how are you?
I'm doing really well, and I just try to remind everybody that the folks who are convinced it'll be a wipeout are the same folks who were convinced Trump wouldn't be president, and the same folks who were convinced that his first year would be a disaster, and you go down the list. I mean, these folks have been so consistently wrong, you can almost take what they're saying, reverse it, and be reasonably sure you're right.
No, it's really true. And I remember before 2016 in November, and you and I both were out there, and we were saying, yeah, of course he can win. And there's a good chance he's going to win. And the media collectively had the shock of their life. And ever since then, have been doing everything in their power to stop this president. There are 81 specific accomplishments in 12 major categories by this president and over 100 other minor achievements, but not the least of which is how even the New York Times now recognizes the economy has turned around rapidly.
Well, it's shocking today that on page one above the fold in the New York Times is a very prominent story about how Trump and his deregulatory efforts and his pro-business attitude have just launched a whole new wave of economic growth. I mean, for the New York Times to write that, what a way to start the new year. Yeah. It was amazing.
Well, if you look at the economy and you look at consumer confidence and you look at nearly 2 million jobs created and you look at, GDP growth and you look at, every economic measure, even the tax bill that passed, this was all before the impact of those tax cuts, which I think will be significant. But then you get rid of the employer mandate. And then after the employer mandate, now you open up drilling in Anwar, which we should have done years and years ago. Then you look at deregulation. You get rid of 21 regulations for each new one adopted. And I mean, it's now created an environment where all these companies are now wanting to invest in factories and manufacturing centers here. And I think energy in particular is going to create a lot of high paying career jobs for people.
Well, I think that's right. And I think you're also seeing across the board, small businesses, the combination of deregulation, so they don't have to spend all their time filling out paperwork for the government, and the tax cuts, which is going to let them keep more money in their pocket. You're really going to see a continuous, I think, growth of economic opportunity. And I think you're going to see the Trump administration continue to move towards more and more good ideas, more and more reforms, with a very clear vision that they want to have in America, which is creating jobs, increasing take-home pay, giving people more opportunities, that they really are so dramatically different from Barack Obama and the left.
Well, I think that's the difference. I mean, and that to me was the biggest closing argument, that after 8 years of Obama, we never had a single year of 3% GDP growth, and we had 8 million more Americans in poverty and 13 million more Americans on food stamps and the lowest labor participation rate and the worst recovery since the 40s or the 30s and, the lowest home ownership rate in 51 years. That matters to people. Those are real people, real lives, dramatically, in that case, negatively impacted.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think there was a great CBS piece last week where CBS interviewed 3 different families in 3 different parts of the country, and all 3 were going to get real tax cuts. And you could just tell that the CBS reporters couldn't quite figure out what they were covering, because that wasn't what they had said every single day up until the bill passed. It was going to be a terrible bill. It was going to hurt people. You know the whole line. Now suddenly it turns out, actually people are going to be better off. And I think that is a remarkable example of why I believe we could have a very different election this fall than anybody's currently ready for.
Now, we talk a lot about the economy because first and foremost, I think people need to see improvement in their lives. I mean, consumer confidence, 17-year high, 2 million jobs created. On top of that, black unemployment at its best level in years, the lowest food stamp usage in 7 years, the best GDP growth in 9 years. I mean, these are all real numbers. But then you pointed out in your column, which is headlined, Underestimate Trump at Your Peril, that Trump hosted 43 world leaders at the White House. He engaged or met with 149 world leaders in 2017. In 183 calls, the president spoke with leaders from 51 countries. That is all in its own right significant and a dramatic turnaround.
Well, and it's a good reminder that when you see President Trump doing things, whether it is moving our embassy to Jerusalem or it is standing up to the Iranian dictatorship on behalf of the Iranian people, he's talking to leaders all around the world while he's doing this. He's not doing this just based on some staff report or some newspaper article. He is really methodically trying to recognize what America needs to do to be successful. And he is learning every single day, and I think the results are starting to pay off. I had a good friend who wrote me a note I thought this morning that was hysterical. He said, we were warned when President Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel that there would be people in the streets. It's just nobody told us they'd be in the streets of Iran.
No, that's a good point. And we now have a lot of new reports out today. We got Iranian protesters attacking police stations. But interestingly, Trump predicted this 4 months ago. Nobody seems to have picked that up. We'll play it on TV tonight. They also, armed protesters stormed an Iranian military base. These protests are now spreading all around the country. We see video now that has emerged, death to the Ayatollah. You got to wonder, what is this regime going to do in light of all of this? What can they do except kill a lot of people?
Well, I think that's the next phase. I mean, in the late 1980s, they had this kind of a problem, and as a result, they had some 80,000 people were killed. This is a very ruthless dictatorship, and my expectation is that the next phase is going to be them trying to kill a whole bunch of people, frankly.
That's pretty scary, and that could happen. I still think the biggest, at least present danger we're facing is North Korea and Kim Jong-un and what his capacity for nuclear weapons will be. The big question is, why does he now want to negotiate with South Korea? That was an interesting development.
Well, I think it may be that all these different pressures are beginning to really come to bear, and that he's really faced with a situation where if he doesn't find some new opening, his regime is just going to disintegrate because of the collapse of the economy. And yeah. I took it as a very good sign for the steady, methodical increase in pressure that President Trump and his team have brought to bear, that Kim Jong-un is making that proposal. And I think that we should feel pretty confident. After all, they're next-door neighbors, and they're ethnically the same people. So if the South Koreans feel comfortable talking with him, I think we should say that's terrific. We're not going to lower our guard. We're not going to count on anything. But it's a good sign in the right direction. If in fact all of a sudden Kim Jong-un feels he has to sit down and talk to people.
What do you make of Orrin Hatch in Utah? And he's retiring, and what appears to be a strong possibility that Mitt Romney, who has been almost virulently anti-Trump, runs for that seat, because I would believe that if he runs, he wins it easily.
I would think that Mitt would win the seat. I think he did a great job with the Winter Olympics years ago. He, of course, has huge relationships all across the state. And it would be interesting in a different way, because he came from Michigan, ended up as governor of Massachusetts, and would now be the senator from Utah. And I think he'd probably be a pretty good senator. He'd be very industrious, very hardworking. He and I, as you know, had a very tough, rough and tumble fight for the nomination in 12. But I've always respected his intelligence, and I think also the world is changing. I would not assume automatically that Mitt would arrive as an anti-Trump Republican. I think that he recognizes that there are a number of things Trump is doing that are quite remarkable, and I suspect when he would actually end up being helpful to Trump and not automatically be in a fight with him.
That would be interesting, because you and I both know there are a lot of Republican senators in particular that hate him. They expect him to conform into something, their image of what they think a president should be, and that's not what got him elected, and that's never going to change. He's not going to be the person they want and behave the way they want.
Right, and I think, frankly, that the people who elected him would be horrified if he spent a lot of his time trying to appease the old order and the old establishment. I mean, I don't think that's why they voted for him in the first place. So I think in that sense, it'll be, I don't think Romney would come in as a pro-Trump person, but I wouldn't automatically assume, for example, I think he would have voted for the tax cuts. I think that fits sort of where he's at in terms of economics. So it would certainly be interesting, but frankly, if you look at some of the relationships Trump has in the Senate now, they're all interesting too. It's partly the nature of having Donald Trump as your president. He's a guy who has a very strong personality, and he doesn't mind exhibiting it.
All right, so let's go to 2017 was, one breathless report after another, hysterical report, often unnamed sources or anonymous sources about Trump-Russia collusion. And we have the issue with Paul Manafort and General Flynn. Nothing had to do with Russia. Do you suspect, as I do, Russia goes away? And have you noticed that those of us that have pointed out some corruption at the highest levels of the deep state or within the Mueller investigation, we are now under attack as somehow being anti-law enforcement? That seems to be the media's new narrative.
Right. Well, I mean, if you are the elite media, your whole world is falling apart. You thought you had this wonderful explanation, largely, I think, invented originally by the Clinton campaign to explain why they lost. Then it turned out none of it's bearing up, none of it's holding water right now, and so they're floundering around. I think the fascinating thing is the damage that's been done by the things we're learning about the FBI, the things we're learning about the cronyism, the things we're learning about the collusion and the attitude of some of these people. It turns out that these were not exactly neutral people in any way. These are people who despised Trump, who thought they had a duty to block him from becoming president, and that's pretty scary. I mean, you don't want to have the Federal Bureau of Investigation populated by people who take it upon themselves to decide what the American people should be allowed to know or to believe.
All right, so the question now is, now that we know that, for example, there was an exoneration of Hillary before an investigation as it relates to Peter Strzok and Jim Comey. And then it raises the questions, do you go back and do you do a real investigation into Hillary? And then we know that there was collusion with Russia, and that's the Hillary Clinton DNC bought and paid for dossier that was designed to, full of Russian lies, designed to influence the American people. And then what do you do about Uranium One when, none of that made sense, and there was a series of instances of bribery and kickbacks and extortion and money laundering that Mueller and other people knew about, but they still allowed Russia to get a foothold in the uranium market in this country. Do we go forward with these things? Do we stop with these things? Do people go to jail over surveillance and unmasking and leaking intelligence, or does it all end?
No, I don't think it can all end now, because I think you've got both congressional investigations and you've got increasing pressure from the Congress and from the American people. I don't think you can walk off, but I don't think you want to go after any one person. What you want to say is, look, the rule of law is at the heart of the American system. The rule of law is the only thing that protects the weak from the poor. I mean, from the powerful. And we have a vested interest in insisting that our Justice Department, the FBI, and other agencies follow the law, and if there, in fact, are sound reasons to believe that a substantial crime has been committed, then they have an obligation to go find out, what happened and to make it public. I think you can't clean this swamp up by trying to cover it up and hoping it'll go away. You've got to have the courage to look it in the face and to insist on real change.
And that means that a lot of prominent Democrats this year should be worried about whether they're going to get indicted.
Well, I certainly think it means that the people who were close to Clinton all have some significant level of risk. I think that's just a fact.
All right, Mr. Speaker, we'll see you tonight on Hannity. Happy New Year to you, and congratulations. I know that Callista was welcomed, I guess, by the Pope officially, and she is the ambassador to the Vatican. Congratulations.
Yes, she's now the ambassador, and I'll tell you, when she had that 25-minute private conversation, just Callista and the Pope and the interpreter, it was quite an experience for somebody from Whitehall, Wisconsin. I think she'll never forget it.
All right. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Congratulations.